It's been an enormous pleasure being with you. Can I just say I've enjoyed quite a few conversations, met quite a few new people, and nothing energises me more. Great to catch up too with the Bennetts, because Bruce, you will all know, was in Warialda for much of the time that I was the member for Gwydir in the northwest. Warialda is a smallish town. It is the scene of my favourite Australian political yarn. I can't help but repeat it. 1949, the election when Menzies and Fadden, my predecessor as Deputy Prime Minister, as it turned out to be, they were doing the rounds, and the issues were the ending rationing after the Second World War, amazingly. There was still rationing in place, and nationalisation of the banks. And Artie Fadden went to Warialda, Bruce. Have you heard this story? Where's Bruce? You have heard it? Oh, what a disappointment. And in those days, you know, not many people had a radio. No one had a television. So he's on the soapbox. And the town's turned out to hear Artie. And he's saying, well, then, petrol rationing. And there's an old fella down the back for whom the great issue was actually contraception. What about contraception? Well, then, butter rationing. What about contraception? We won't nationalise the banks. What about contraception? This went on for about half an hour. And eventually the bloke said, Artie, you've told us all your policies, but what's your policy on contraception? Do you believe in it or don't you? He said, as a matter of fact, I do, and in your case, I'm going to pass special retrospective legislation. Anyway. It is my profound belief that we are living at a civilisational moment. There have been many civilisations down through the ages. All of them, if you like, have been powered up by strong, thought-through ideas that have been supported by sufficient numbers of people in that civilisation to keep the engine fuelled. All of them have eventually started to run low on fuel. Ours is running low on fuel. The engine is starting to splutter very badly, and it is going to peter out unless we refuel it or find an alternative fuel. The only option is to become, like so many civilisations before us, essentially defunct. I think it is as stark as that. I mentioned Neil Ferguson. In a conversation with him now about 3 years ago in California, I asked him, as the world's leading economic historian, what he saw as the three greatest threats to our freedoms in the West, loosely defined. And he said, in ascending order, the threat of terrorism, a bad state actor or Islamic extremists obtaining a true weapon of mass destruction and using it more effectively in a way that just blows up the Western economies. He said the second greatest threat is the real possibility, more live now than it was then, of miscalculation between the superpower and the rising superpower. But he said the greatest threat, which if we could only stabilise and work through and so forth, help us resolve the other two great threats, is that we despise our own history. We have turned our backs on all the things that made us free and prosperous. We've not only not refueled the machine, we're trying to put the wrong fuel in it to kill off the fuel that it originally ran on. And David Brooks, who writes, of all things, for the New York Times, which was once a journal of record, that is now so partisan it's not funny, but he's a great writer. And he said at no time in his life can he remember American society, and I am really using that as shorthand for Western society, to be so fractured, so atomised, and so distrustful. And I want to focus for a moment on that idea of trust. Whenever two or three are gathered together, trust becomes an issue, doesn't it? These people I've just met, can I trust them? To the extent that I can trust them, we can move forward together to the advantage of all. To the extent that I don't, I'll go looking for security. I'll stand back. I'll say, no, I'm not so sure about this. I think I'd better flee for safety rather than engaging in meaningful ways. And I believe that the breakdown of our trust in our society is now really threatening us. We have become so cynical, haven't we? The Australian National University, like all universities, has to do something that's valuable, has been tracking trust in federal parliament and the politicians there since 1970, and the graph's gone like that. There was a significant blip of increased trust in 1996 when a certain wonderful government was elected. And to my absolute disbelief, it slowly petered out and the graph continued to head south. There was a much bigger spike in the Rudd election of 2007. At that time, it didn't peter out quickly. It lasted about 13, 14 months and it just went through the floor. And now, the only blip we've had since then was a brief one when people thought the Morrison government would keep us safe, and the state governments, from COVID. And as the whole mess unfolded, and I'm not going there tonight, that dissipated away and we're back into despair country. Think of the Royal Commission of Inquiry into the banks of a few years ago. We learnt that the AMP, whose official historian Geoffrey Blaney had said when it was set up as the Australian Mutual Providential Society and was about looking after people who might fall on hard times or widows that lost their husbands, it was a mutual society. It became the most trusted, think about this carefully, institution in Australia after the churches. Well, we're pretty aware they don't trust us much now, aren't we? And the AMP, well, we learnt that you couldn't trust them with your buck. This is immensely damaging. And then there's Qantas. Need I say any more now? At every level, trust is breaking down. Trust in one another, trust between the elected and the elector, trust between the banker and the person who does the banking, trust between, if you like, the police and the courts and citizens who are looking for justice, trust and confidence in the church as the place where we can find life and hope and a moral compass. It's worse than that. We've lost trust in the underlying beliefs and ideas and values that set those institutions up. And that, I believe, is extraordinarily worrying. You see, with apologies to Os Guinness, and I've just said that my second conversation with him, we put it up, I think, September, October last year, maybe a bit later, November. And I recommend it, not because of me, but because of him. I love Oz's writings. He's written a book called The Magna Carta of Humanity. And in it, I think he sets out in a way better than anybody else. I mean, there are wonderful and gifted writers like Douglas Murray, several of you have quoted him to me, describing the mess we've got ourselves into. And, you know, all the extraordinary things that trouble us, whether it's critical theory or whether it's critical race theory or critical gender theory or critical queer theory or critical fat theory. I'm having trouble saying it now. You know, or whether it's identity politics or whether it's wokery or whatever, Oz goes to a really high picture or high level picture of how was our modern world shaped. And I think this is really useful. In essence, he talks about the Sinai Revolution and the French Revolution. Well, that sounds a bit archaic, doesn't it? What does he mean? And interestingly enough, people like Jordan Peterson are picking this up. And an extraordinary thing through the podcast, I was able to introduce them. And they got talking about Exodus. But Oz's theory is that the American forefathers particularly were influenced greatly by the covenantal idea of government that comes out of the Torah, particularly Deuteronomy and Exodus. And, you know, you have, let my people go, and I will enter into a covenant, so much higher than a contract. A contract is where you try to narrow everything down and look for opportunities to break it if something goes wrong. A covenant you enter into willingly, and you say, I will bring this to the table and make these commitments. In return, you will. It's a mutual thing, God and his people, that then flows out horizontally. I will accept responsibility for those around me. I will govern myself wisely, and I will look after my neighbour. And within that framework, in the Western tradition, the Sinai Revolution down through the Magna Carta, the machinations and backwards and forwards of everything that happened in the UK, including, I would argue, the age of the evangelicals, abolition of slavery, decent labour laws, and so forth, evolved a model that has produced freedom. It's based, of course, in a realistic understanding of human beings. It's not utopian. This is one of the great things that Christianity brings to an understanding of life. We are flawed, though we have dignity and worth. And so the American forefathers and ours, when they built our constitution on the best that had been learnt from the English and the Americans, set up a constitution that divided power, ensured that nobody could get too much of it for too long, so that we had our democratic rights to choose who'd govern us and therefore which direction we'd go in, but we had the pencil to remove them when they got full of themselves. Some happens to some politicians, you know. And it produced freedom based in a realistic view of man's failings. The French Revolution was short, mercifully, and bloody and horrible. And in some ways, it probably, as a product of the Enlightenment, it reflected a right pursuit of freedom, but it was utopian. And it failed because it was utopian. But it did immense damage. Karl Marx was an admirer. Engels were admirers of the French Revolution. And they produced Das Kapital. Would have been forgotten if it hadn't been for Lenin and Marx and others. You know, the horrors of the Russian Revolution and of the Chinese Revolution and communist uprisings everywhere. Utopianism has produced misery on a grand scale. And our world is now being shaped because we have lost sight of the Sinai Revolution and the new form of Gramsci-inspired cultural Marxism. And a couple of people said to me at lunchtime, trouble is if you use that language, you sound like you're talking about Reds under the bed. Rob Smith, many of you will know Rob, brilliant guy, Moore College, SMBC. He's written a fantastic paper on this. He said we shouldn't be too afraid to use the word because they did. And Gramsci's idea, well, why did the communist revolution in Russia, why was it not replicated everywhere else? The strength of the institutions in those societies, the strength of the foundation stones, you know, the parliaments, democracy, the courts of law, the churches, family. And so you had eventually evolving, and it was actually a term that they used, the long march through the left, and it has succeeded unbelievably powerfully. And in the name of what some people now call wokery, you have all of these strange theories floating around, and it has infested everything. It's spilled out from academia into the cultural industry, arts, drama, media. It's now inflicted itself in our schoolrooms, in our politics, and in business. It is extraordinary stuff, and it is challenging everything. Let me go to how we might define the freedoms that the Sinai model has given us. 1 step back, 2 forward, 3 back, 4, 5 forward, as it's been, but where we got to. I think, in many ways, the most useful definition of freedom as a cutting block is the one that Isaiah Berlin came up with. Oh, I got it right that time. See, there was Irving Berlin and there was Isaiah Berlin. One played music and the other was a Jewish philosopher at Oxford. Winston Churchill one day said to his staff, I want to meet Isaiah Berlin to talk about his ideas. And his staff went to a lot of trouble, and in came Irving and said, would you like me to play the piano for me? And he said, no, I wanted to talk philosophy. And they all looked at aghast at one another and they'd got it wrong. Those were the days. I love those Churchill yarns. You know, George Bernard Shaw was quite a friend of Churchill's. He was an interesting guy. He was an atheist, of course. And he was, however, quite civil. And they say if you, see, our age can't cope with disagreement, can it? We don't know how to relate to people. We just hate them if they disagree with us. But G.K. Chesterton and George Bernard Shaw were very close friends. And G.K. was huge and put on a lot of weight, as only wealthy men could back in the 1920s. And George Bernard Shaw was a little man who carried no spare weight at all. And they met one another in London, having not seen one another for quite a while. And Big GK said to George, "By George, you look as though there's a famine in England." And George Bernard Shaw shot straight back, "And GK, you look like you're the single-handed cause of it." But Churchill got the better of George Bernard Shaw. You may have heard this story. In those days, there were 8 return mails in London a day. It was, sort of early version of the internet, instant sort of email, demand and answer. And Churchill got an invitation from George Bernard Shaw, "Dear Winston, enclosed please find 2 tickets for the opening night of my show tonight, one for you and one for a friend, in brackets, if you have one." So Churchill shot back by return mail, "Regret, cannot make tonight, will come to tomorrow night, in brackets, if you have one." Irving Berlin, I just think this is such a useful chopping block for us as believers. He said that freedom needs to be thought of in a much more sophisticated way than just thinking it means we can do what we like. He talked about the freedom from, or what he called negative freedom. Freedom from the things that mean you are restricted in what you can do. You're captive. It could be oppressive governments. It could be a police state and the fear of being woken up in the middle of the night and dragged off. The fear of never being able to express your own views or act in accordance with your conscience. It could be personal addiction of any number of type. If it causes you to be locked up from external or internal forces, you need to be free. So they're the negative freedoms. If you have achieved freedom at that level, you can then go on to what? Do whatever you like? No. Do what you ought to do. Reach your potential. Be a responsible citizen. Find yourself in service. But what actually happens, of course, is that the human temptation is to say, "I'm free, I will now do as I like." We turn freedom into license, and then ironically, freedom becomes the enemy of freedom. And that's where we're at in the cycle. What has actually happened is that we have given way to selfishness, it's all about me, and to license, I will do as I like. And I touched on it this morning. We've now reached the absurd point where this has gone to such extremes that a German academic, and I can't remember his name now, at a very prestigious German university was asked the other day, "Can you see an end to the never-ending advancement of secular individualism?" And he said, "No, all my research shows there is nothing pulling it up." Another way of putting it would be in the Carl Trueman language. Many of you will have read his books, or again, there's a certain podcast where you can go and listen to him. And he talks about how now we've reached the point where people are tempted to say, and behave as though it's a case of, "I feel, therefore I am." Autonomy, the self, is tied up with the greatest virtue. We want to live as islands. It doesn't work, as Roger Scruton pointed out. If you stop and think about it for a moment, people had to make way for you when you were born. You were interdependent. They demonstrated love and sacrifice in order to give you a start because you were hopeless and helpless, and for quite a chunk of your life, you couldn't have done it without them. Perhaps because we don't have families anymore, though, we've lost sight of that reality. And so many people really do now live as though they are an agent unto themselves. The fruit of this is bitter for the individual, I would proffer, and it is disastrous for society. The personal fruit is all around us, particularly amongst young people. I am deeply troubled by the levels of reported anxiety, of depression, of addiction, the pandemic of loneliness, and self-harm, especially amongst young men. So, Mr. Progressive, how's it going for you? And yet, the world's answer seems to be, as I just said, a German academic making the point, more of the same seems to be our determination. Socially, It's turning out to be a disaster as well. Because particularly the activists, and I have to say this, particularly the activists in the sexual revolution that started in the 60s and has now produced such loneliness and misery. It's been such a cruel hoax, hasn't it? I needn't elaborate. But the activists in that sphere in particular turn out to be quite profoundly anti-community, and a democracy can only work if we have a sense of community, and especially the most basic community of all, family. And I just gave you some raw stats on the abandonment of family as an ideal, even the very idea of having children. That's a disaster for our societies. I don't know where, I met a lovely lady the other day who's a regular churchgoer, and she said, my children have married so late, and I don't think they'll have many children, but I don't suppose it matters. And I said, a society that gives up on a marriage is a society that's giving up on itself, even just in economic terms. 92 countries, including virtually, I think, every single Western country and ours as well, having way below replacement numbers of children. There'll be no tax base for old grey-haired guys like me when I'm in my dotage. This is very sad. I was talking to a fellow at a Church of England in Sydney the other day, and he's quite a character. And he was sent to a church a few years ago by the powers that be in Sydney. And it was quite a vibrant church, but it was ageing, and he wanted to get more young people in, so he pulled the two back rows of the pews out so that Sunday evening they could have a service for young people. And he said, one of my favourite old constituents came to me and sort of took me by the arms and said, this is terribly worrying. I have a lot of friends, and there won't be room for them all in the church when I die, and we have my funeral. And he said, it's all right, Betty. You'll be out the front. It won't worry you. This selfish individualism is a real problem for government. It's a huge problem for government because it leads to anarchy. The idea we can all do our own thing, no common narrative, no commitment to our neighbour. It's all about me. It feeds identity politics. This business of splitting us up where we divide according to people who agree to our little particular issue of whatever it is at the time. We never focus on the fact that much binds us together. We share so much as fellow Australians, and it particularly turns out to be hostile to faith, because faith insists that you find yourself in surrendering your identity, in submitting to the God of the universe who offers a way to restore us in Jesus Christ. It's the very antithesis of the idea that we can find our God from within. As a matter of logic, of course, it all goes horribly wrong for the very simple reason that we're not up to the task of being God. The way this is playing out, though, in an immediate sense in our societies, I just want to put a way of thinking about it for you that's important. What the Sinai Revolution produced was, in a sense, an arrangement whereby government was to be firmly downstream of culture. Does that make sense? And culture's downstream, of course, of beliefs and values. So when you hear, if you ever have, an American asked what democracy is, their standard answer will often be the Lincoln line, government of the people, by the people, for the people. You've all heard that? Do you know where Lincoln got that from? A Christian pastor. A sermon a few months before he gave that famous address. Where had the pastor got it from? John Wycliffe, Oxford, in the 14th century. What was Wycliffe talking about? The Torah model of government, subsidiarity, accept responsibility for yourself and for your neighbours. Power and leadership belongs at the base of the triangle, and you only work up to the apex. The apex should really only be responsible for things that you can't do yourself or that you need by consent to let government do for you. You've got to be able to govern yourself. What was he talking about? People should read the Bible so they know what their responsibilities are. They know how to be good citizens under God and to their neighbours. And so what emerged out of that then came, and I think the order here is quite important. Fortescue, John Fortescue, the idea of private property. It's a biblical concept. We live in an age when many Christians think profit and private property are horrible notions for greedy capitalists. but actually 2 of the 10 commandments go to property rights. It's a very important principle. People will not flourish. If I'm a farmer and I produce 2 sacks of wheat and I want to trade one because I don't need them both to my neighbour who's brilliant at making knives, as long as the trade deal's fair, we both profit, don't we? But if some overlord, some government, some cruel landlord comes and takes my second sack of wheat and probably a bit more and leaves my family in need, I'm not going to produce a second sack of wheat if it's going to be taken from me. Private property, to defend yourself against overlords. Exactly the same applies to your trained up intellect that you want to sell on a job market. It's your right to go and expect that that will be respected and that you can trade it. It's a really important principle. It's there to defend you against government. What's the point? Government's downstream of the individual. The individual should never be a selfish doctrine. If I matter, so do you. Don't hear me advocating the idea that we should all be individuals. I'm not doing that at all. Just that God gives us each worth and dignity. Other freedoms, though, because it's a 4-legged stool. Property rights, it's a strange place to start, I know. People usually start with free speech, but they all go together. Frank Ferruti, an atheist, said on one of my podcasts, I said, do you think free speech is the most important freedom because it's the one we defend the others by? He said, well, it's probably not the most important, but it wasn't the first either. He said the first in our modern age was when people realised that burning one another at the stake for differences of belief and conscience was unconscionable, unchristian, and pretty damn stupid, because the people who you were burning one day would be in the majority the next day, then they'd burn you, and that's what happened. We learnt to live with one another's deepest differences, and part of the genius of the success of Western cultures like ours has been the respect for the other person, in the sense we may disagree, but I will respect your right to your beliefs and your conscience. Freedom of speech, massively threatened in Australia today, in 2 ways. Lack of viewpoint diversity in the public square, and particularly in our universities, but more particularly, and every one of you will know what this is, self-censorship. We're all afraid now, aren't we, to say what we really think. That is an unbelievable threat to our well-being as a culture and a society. And then there's freedom of assembly. None of the other freedoms are worth a row of beams if we can't freely meet here and say to ourselves, we meet as common-minded people. And yes, we have the right to discriminate. The hypocrisy of politicians who want to do away with the freedom to assemble in schools and charities. You know about that debate at the moment. Freedom of religion. Everybody's protected. I mean, isn't it incredible? Since the 1970s, we've been building all this architecture to defend our rights against other people's rights. So Australians compete with fellow Australians for their rights. It's a nonsense. It's an absolutely hopeless substitute for the old idea that you loved your neighbour and you did to them as you'd have them do to you. That was a far more powerful doctrine, wasn't it? And that was phased out. Then we had tolerance, got to tolerate everything. But now that's gone. We've got a new absolutism. But it's so important for us to recognise the need to be able to encourage people to speak their minds, to explore ideas, and to talk freely. Now, here's the rub. Why did I start with property rights? They're a clear recognition that we need protecting from government. That freedom and the others in a democracy functioning properly reflect the dignity and the worth of the individual, and in terms of the split between that which is God and that which is Caesar's, our freedoms are recognised and supported by a loving God. They're ours. And government's job is to respect that if it's working properly, and defend our freedoms against their own inclination and their bureaucrats and experts' inclination to want to take more and more power for themselves. And one of the great measures of our failing civilization is that we now flee to government for security at every point. It's incredible the way Australians do that. There's a problem, the government's got to solve it. And as one of the American, I think it was Adams, American founding fathers said, or was it Franklin? He who seeks security over freedom is worthy of neither. Let me pull all of this together. I've just tried to give you an overview of the terrible price we are paying for the abandonment of Christianity. I'm trying to say to you that it is leaving our people empty and gutted and unsure, without purpose, without meaning. As Churchill, to quote him again, said, when you leave your young people like that because you've not explained their history to them, they're actually open to Karl Marx's dictum that a people without their history are easily persuaded. G.K. Chesterton, many people have said it, but he put it brilliantly. When we say we stop believing in God, we don't start believing in nothing, we believe in anything. And that's a mark of our culture. Have you noticed how quickly these extraordinary fads come up and then they die off and another even more ridiculous one appears? I speak to the tragedy of our modern society in a lost direction and say this: there is no hope there. We, through no merit of our own, are the possessors of the keys to hope. It is the gospel. We must never doubt that. No matter how the very people that we want to love and reach with that gospel reject it, we must stand firm, because I believe the times that are coming will see people not only in desperate need, but starting to say, who can provide a way forward? And through Jesus Christ, and with all modesty, and with great thankfulness, we need to believe that that is us. And it's such a joy to be with you all, because I know you believe that. And I just want to say to you, for somebody who's served in the secular world, never doubt it. You have a secure hope. And our fellow Australians need that, because they are in a hopeless situation at the moment. Thanks very much.
There is no other name. We've got a few questions for you, John. Thank you for your time. You have said...
How many times did you flash up that 5-minute warning?
I only did it once, and
only
you
once?
saw it, yeah. And I don't think you even
Do I
took
get
5
a
minutes
chockie
after
for
that? Definitely. Yep. We were saying we don't have socks for you, but Josh has got some on that we were going to take off.
I need a pair for John Cleese.
That was very good. Been practicing. John, you said that things have been getting worse regarding secularisation.
Yep.
The person who wrote this question actually wonders whether they're beginning to see some cracks in secularisation.
Yes.
And whether they're actually starting to feel a little more optimistic about evangelism over the last 15 years. Is that something that you have felt?
Yes.
Do you think the tide might be about to turn?
There are some optimistic signs. I understand that a careful analysis of the latest National Church Life Survey results will suggest that the bleeding of people away from church in the under 25 age bracket is slowing and may have halted, and some evidence of an uptick. Now, that's immensely encouraging. A bit disappointing that many young Christians will then say, but it's a private matter, I'm not going to take it into the public square. We must challenge that idea. One of the things that keeps me going with the podcast is a constant feed. It's not massive, I don't want to mischaracterise it, but of young people saying, we can't get these ideas at school, university, in our workplace, and we love it. And it's led to so many gospel conversations. And I think I can say to people who have actually been converted. And I even had an academic ring me the other day, and this is a true story, I won't say too much about it, but she was doing a PhD on social sciences, on social work. And she said it was such a lefty course. I won't mention which university, but I mean, could have been any, couldn't it? And she said, I was agonising. How am I going to get through? Because I just don't believe a lot of what we're being taught. And I stumbled across your podcast, so I started to find thinkers who were both Christian and conservative, and compassionate. And I was able to write a thesis that got me my PhD. And then my tutor said, how are you going to celebrate? And she said, well, I love painting in my spare time. And she said, and the tutor said, oh, well, why don't you go and do a portrait of Grace Tame? for the Archibald. And she said, I completely ruined his day. She said, no, I'm going to ask John Anderson if I can do his portrait. She said, it was a very good thing I said it after I'd done the PhD, not before.
I think we're all going to Google that afterwards and have a look.
Please don't. You'll get me into trouble or her into trouble. That'd be worse.
I love this question. It's now my question too. If the left find it hard to engage with reason, how do we engage them with the gospel when it ties faith with reason?
I think that's a really good question. And this is it's a half-baked answer, but I think there are 2 points I'd make. And I think we need to get much better and more sophisticated at both. In other words, I'm throwing this out as a challenge, help. I think one of the things you can do is gently question. You know, is that what you think? Why do you think that? Why, who has, convinced you of that? Have you heard an alternative view? What if what you're saying is right? And the second part of that is to put up an alternative moral dilemma. And climate change is an obvious one where young people are immensely concerned about it. There was a recent survey that showed if you said we have a horrific problem with modern day slavery, which is true, a lot of young people will say, that's even more urgent, that's just so evil. They've got a conscience. We ought to deal with that before climate change. Then if you see that in the paper. As a farmer, fascinated by agricultural research and so delighted at the progress we've made in feeding the disadvantaged. We're providing, the world's farmers are now providing another 5 billion daily diets around the world. And the proportion of people who are hungry has fallen away. It's unbelievable. But it's massively threatened by the Ukrainian war. What the Russians are doing is so immoral. But worse than that, by ill thought out climate policies. So there's a moral dilemma. What comes first? How do you manage the trade-offs? So you put up an alternative. It's, yes, looking after the planet is a great moral objective. Feeding people is a great moral objective. There are trade-offs that are going to have to be made here. If you doubt my words, did you see the riots on television in Sri Lanka? That was about climate change policy gone wrong. Said they'll stop using ammonia-based fertilisers because they're made out of fossil fuels. That was our great contribution from Sri Lanka at COP, was it 46? And within 6 months, their people are starving. So the 2 points. We've got to learn how to, I don't want to sound, it's a crude term to use, but how to prick balloons by asking the right questions so people sort of say, maybe it's not as simple as I thought. I haven't got any answers to that. Because a lot of the time you'll find they haven't. It's just the zeitgeist. They picked it up. It's the vibe. And the other thing is, we've got to learn to gently say to people, there are other moral choices in the universe as well that may be affected by your obsession with this one.
Really helpful. We had 3 questions come in about this. John, you can guess what it is. Help us to think Christianly about the voice.
Yeah. I get quite emotional about this because I've grown up with Aboriginal people. I went to school with them. I come from Gunnedah, where the one and only full story of an Aboriginal hero, the Red Kangaroo, that's not a Dreamtime story, it's pre-European, was written. And it reveals, it's a story about a hero operating in a really corrupt environment. Hello, good and bad, just like every society. And I represented. The Aboriginal people in my electorate used to say they were 11% of my voters. I was never able to check it, but that was their claim. And nothing gets me more upset than seeing those little Aboriginal kids in the Walgetts and the Burkes and so forth of this world, their lives just being thrown up against the wall. But I have very deep concerns about the voice. Firstly, I don't think it'll work because I think the activists will get hold of it. I have to be honest. I know not all of you agree, but just my position. And the activists will get hold of it. And they will use it in ways that will make Australians resent them, and mainstream Indigenous people will really feel it. Two Aboriginal friends of mine from home, one a farmer and one a scientist, both said to me recently, bad things have happened, but we just love being mainstream Australians. We love our lives, and we don't want any more focus on us. That's what they said. So that's reason one. Reason two is that I think the democratic process has been seriously damaged here. I just don't think it's appropriate to withhold detail, to treat people like mugs. Of course it's about more than the voice. Of course it is. I'm sorry, if anybody wants to contest that, just go to the people who are proposing it, who are saying this is a hook for the next steps. And they haven't been open. You're a free country. If you believe in all these other things, that's fine. But tell us, don't break trust by not being transparent anymore. And the way the elites are backing this, the experts telling the rest of us, that's not democratic. It's not right. And lastly, Galatians 3:28. I profoundly believe that we're all one in Jesus Christ, that he makes no distinction. We all have souls equal in his sight. There's no Greek, no slave nor free, no Greek nor Gentile, sorry, I got that wrong. Jew nor Greek, there's no man or woman. We're all one in Jesus Christ. And it took us centuries to understand the absolute imperative of that principle. No one should be above the law, no one below it. And I am just personally of a view that we should not allow any incrementalism in the Constitution. It should be blind to whoever we are, wherever we live. But I don't want any of that to sound like I don't care. I actually care very deeply. And here's something I've never said publicly before. I'm here tonight because my great-great-great-grandmother and her children in the Hunter Valley were left when my great-great-great-grandfather had to go to Sydney, and that was, 3 or 4 days to get down on the packet and several days to get back after he'd finished his business. And a white man killed a black man, and a tribe went rampaging and wanted to seek revenge. And the local Aboriginal men surrounded my great-great-great-grandmother and my great-great-grandfather and his siblings and said, these are good people, they care for us, and we are not going to let them be touched. So I just say that because some of you will have a different view, and I deplore racism. I love history. I think the greatest human rights movement of all times was an attack on racism by William Wilberforce and the evangelicals. Inconveniently, privileged white males, and Christians at that. So philosophically, I just cannot come to grips with the idea that we're not all recognising our equality. And the tragedy here is that there are some Australians who are living in very necessitous circumstances, and we need to lift them up. And the only thing I'd say about that is we've got to focus on breaking the cycle of violence against women and their baby children. Because that first 3 years, Erica Commissar, one of the conversations I had, is so critical. And we know now that when you're a newborn, the anxiety centres of the brain are not fully formed. And if mum's not there, and if she's not secure, and the baby's not secure in those first 5 years, you're damaged for life. And why aren't we talking about that? Why are we not talking about that as a central issue? Because you can't access all the other good things that Australia and our society can do for you if your life's truncated because of what we've done to you in your first 3 years. Sorry, I actually got a bit emotional about it. If I've offended anybody with that, can I say I'm genuinely sorry? But you asked, and I felt I should be honest.
Thank you for sharing your heart and concerns on it. It's clearly a point for us to pray for great wisdom.
And reconciliation.
Yes.
This act of reconciliation has split the country down the middle.
Thank you. Tell us, how long do you think this cultural moment is going to last? And if it's not forever, what's the next thing?
I say to you with all respect and in true humility, God only knows. I don't. What I do know is that if we are not there, there will be no picking up the pieces. Because we are in the hands and the feet of Christ. We've been reached because of the church, haven't we? I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for the church that had trained up people who were able to impact my life. You're the church, and you're the leaders of the church. And if they're to hear the message, it'll be through you. So Preach always with words if necessary. Oh, I shouldn't say that to a bunch of preachers, should I? Yeah? But you know what I mean.
Well, thank you, John. We're going to take a moment to see how this lands. Actually, we're going to take more than a moment. We're going to take a little bit of time now to see how this lands in a couple of specific contexts around FIEC. So I'm going to welcome Josh back up, and we're going to take a seat.
I just got to tell you one last thing.
Please do.
If you want to know where real power lies, I'm a former aviation minister. I'll tell you where it lies, since we're thinking about Qantas. A friend of mine, and this is a true story, was lined up to fly to LA. And the fella in front of him was in a really bad mood, and he was really personally abusive of the lady wanting to ticket him. And when he got to the desk, he said, I cannot tell you how much I admire your patience and civility in the face of the way that sod spoke to you. She said, oh, we're well trained here. You know, the corporate manners and all the rest of it. We're told never to take it personally. So I kept saying to myself, well, one of three things. The taxi was late. He had an argument with his wife, or he had a bad prawn last night. I think he probably had the bad prawn last night. And my friend said, really? That's all too? Yes, that's all there is. He said, no, there's a little smirk on your face. There's more to this. No. Yes, there is. And after a while, she confessed. She said, please don't tell. And remember, this is a true story. Said, when you struggle off the plane in LA tomorrow morning, feeling jet-lagged and dreadful, go down and you'll find, he's getting to LA too. Both of you will find your luggage on carousel 2. Yours will be in LA and his will be in Amsterdam.
Well, who needs to stand up and stretch? We can just laugh. We're going to explore 2 issues related to our churches and our cultural moments. So the first is around buildings. And please welcome Tim and Michael up. Tim, Michael, where are you guys? Come on up. Tim, we're going to start with you, but let's make sure we all fit on this. Tim, tell us where you're at, and then we're going to talk about buildings together. So,
yeah. So I'm up in Coffs Harbour. Been there for 3.5 years. Planted. A couple of people come up with us, and there's some mob in town that wanted to help us plant, and so planted a church called Anchor Church, which apparently is that's what to call your church these days. So, not to be confused with the new emerging Anchor Church in Melbourne.
That's right. Yep, there's
Well,
Anchor, Salt and Cross and Crown.
Yeah, right.
No one thought to trademark them.
Yeah, it's all good.
So Tim, what have you experienced? What are the headwinds with getting a place to meet in for Anchor Church?
Yeah, so in 3.5 years, we've made 5 or 6 major moves, like in venue. So we've joked about calling ourselves the Gypsy Church because we just keep packing the trailer and moving to the next venue. You know, some places we've grown out of, other places we've kind of worn out our welcome and had to move, and other places there's been all kinds of complications. So yeah, but we've moved a lot. Yeah.
I'm from Coffs. I know that a great place to meet, and we've talked about this, would be the TAFE, the university complex there. You guys have been trying to get in there.
Yeah.
What's happened?
Yeah, the ideal place for us would be, it's the education campus that's shared by TAFE, Southern Cross University, and a seniors college. And we had our foot in the door. We'd signed the papers. They were really keen to have us. Excellent place for us. It would be very helpful. And then at the final hour, TAFE New South Wales, who apparently own the land that it's all on, pulled the plug and under the restriction that you're not to rent to political or sectarian groups. So right at the last minute that got pulled from us, and we were quite confused. The locals really wanted us to have us there because, that's a good group to have in your university. And so we were seeking clarification around what they meant by sectarian. But we just kept hitting Stonewall. We couldn't get clarification on it. That was about a year ago, and we're still trying, and we're going to go back again and seek clarification there. So it either means they're categorising us as an FIEC church as a sect, that's broken away from mainstream Christian denomination, in which case we can try and clarify that, I reckon, but we can't even get the conversation at the moment. Or they're just saying bisectarian religious or churches, any churches. And, TAFE New South Wales, that's like a 130-year-old education institution in our state, and I'm sure it's got Christian heritage, and it's somehow. But yeah, that's a pretty interesting ruling that cuts out all churches if that's the case. So yeah.
I'm going to go to Michael. Michael, tell us the story about buildings in your ministry. First at Lakes and now at Soul Church. in
Yeah.
Wollongong.
So Lakes, I think it was FIEC conference 2015. I remember very clearly. Michael Callahan, he's got a legal background. He was the executive director of Freedom for Faith. Spoke to us as pastors and said, if you're meeting in a church hall, school hall. Yeah, if you're meeting in a school hall, you want to have a plan within the next 5 years to not be in a school hall because those cultural headwinds are coming. Not trying to scare you, not trying to be scaremongering. So Dave, Sheath and I, we were thinking about how to talk to church about these things. Church had already bought a block of land. And I think we were still thinking it's pretty theoretical. Within 6 months, someone came at us with incredible aggression, an atheist, anti-Christian. It was over a sermon I preached on Leviticus 18, which people said I'd preached faithfully and graciously. He disagreed. And we thought the principle would be reasonable with us, that it's unfounded. We're just doing what we do as a Christian church. But she disagreed, and she said it's going to be a formal complaint. So Dave and I ended up at the principal's office. We felt like naughty schoolboys, but honestly walked into the principal's office and it felt like a police interview. So my sermon, which was transcribed word for word, was on the table. And we came out of that meeting praying and also contacting a lawyer within our congregation who was incredibly helpful to us, and also contacting marquee hire companies. Middle of winter, thinking we're just so close to being kicked out of school. We're not getting backed by our principal. That complaint went through the Department of Education. It made it all the way to New South Wales Parliament. It's just so confronting to think, wow, someone really hates us. And it wasn't a large group or anything. But I think we'd forgotten 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, if you want to live a godly life, you will be persecuted. Or 1 Peter 4, that don't be surprised. We're just living in a bit of a fantasy world to think that you can be Christian, follow Jesus, and you won't get a hard time. But yeah, under the graciousness of God, sovereignty of God, we got to stay in the school because we were paying pretty good rent. But I think that man actually helped our church get even more serious about the gospel, about growth, and about raising money towards a building. So I drive past Lakes Church now, and I go, that guy really helped this.
That's his legacy.
That's his legacy.
So everyone needs a guy like that.
Yeah.
How do we get in contact with him?
Yeah, it was incredible. Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah, it's sad, isn't it? And we prayed for that man as well. But lots of lessons learnt there. Yeah.
So a clear gospel headwind, you nearly lose your property, but it actually galvanises people for the gospel, leads to people generously giving, and there's a building there now. And now you're pastoring Salt Church in Wollongong. You're in facilities that you don't own. What's happening now?
Yeah, so we're in a great facility. We've got a good relationship with the landlord, who is the local council. But it does give me little shivers that our landlord is local government, and they've been great. There's lots of reasons why we are motivated to buy a building. So the council's told us the building will be demolished. That's a good reason. They haven't told us when, so it's a bit like the return of Jesus. Just be ready. But we're also, under God, we're outgrowing the building. But thirdly, just saying to church, we may have a great run in getting facilities, but we may not. And as you grow, it's just going to be incredibly difficult to relocate. And long term, what's good for Wollongong is us purchasing, putting some money down, having that foundation as a place to preach the gospel for when we're well and truly gone. And so let's do that. And church has really rallied behind that. So did you have another question?
I was going to say, how'd they respond? Yeah.
Yeah, they did respond incredibly well. And I think it's a great testimony to the gospel that when we capture that Jesus is Lord and live for him, and we do it in such imperfect ways, it does change our values, our priorities, and we make sacrifices, and it even affects our wallets. And so people sacrificially pledged, and they've pledged $1 million towards a building, which is fantastic.
Wonderful.
Yeah. So we praise God for that. And we just know there's a long journey ahead. And come and see me if you'd like to donate.
That's good stuff. So thanks, Michael. And we'll finish with Tim. So you're still in the thick of it with buildings then. How has this actually, has it created any tailwinds for the gospel? There's headwinds against you, but...
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. I mean, God's sovereign over it all. You see his hand of providence through all the moves. Someone said a few days ago, if you just leave your church alone, you'll successfully decline. So, like, change just keeps coming, and if you look for the opportunity in it, there's stacks of opportunity. So, yeah, it's been... Every time we've had to move, there's lots of communication you got to do, and in the midst of that, you need to keep explaining why we exist and what we're trying to do. So you're envisioning people on the run, and you're trying to build your teams constantly to cope with the change and the growth, and it just keeps you on your toes as a church. And it's so as exhausted as we are, Dave and Darcy are here, and Dave managed a lot of the last change, and we've got another one coming probably soon. But yeah, it's as exhausting it is, it's so good. It's so good. It keeps us moving. And so, yeah, there's a good tailwind behind that.
It's great. Thanks, guys. It's great to hear.